Hi everyone, and welcome to the Irish Saints video blog. I'm Gary McLaughlin, and this weekend I was just at an Irish festival, Irish Fest in Atlanta, and it was wonderful. I got to sell my book in my hometown, but um, what struck me about this, and this is very similar to all Scottish and Irish festivals here in the United States and indeed across the world, that there was Celtic everything. There was Celtic music and Celtic food and Celtic this and Celtic that. And of course, in my book, um, I talk about Celtic spirituality. So I thought, you know what, it might be fun to do a few video entries where I ask the question, what is Celtic spirituality? What is it? Um, I talk about this a lot in my book, The Virtues of the Irish Saints. And, in many ways, my wife and I, we have been followers of a Celtic way and Celtic spirituality for maybe 30 years, ever since we lived in Ireland and went to church in Ireland. But what is that? What does it mean? And back in the 90s, there was a big resurgence of all things Celtic and Celtic spirituality. And there was a guy called Ian Bradley who wrote a book, and I bought it back in the 90s called The Celtic Way. And he maybe wrote this about 1996 or so. And, for me, it was very influential. I read it, and he spoke about the poetic nature of the Celtic way and how these Celtic saints embodied a kind of a poetic calling, and there was a lot of emphasis on the Trinity, and it was very influential for me. I remember I read it at the time, and I reread it and read it again, and um, but over the years, my view on what is Celtic spirituality, I suppose, has changed a lot and has really simplified. So in my book, I really ask that question: what is Celtic spirituality? What's interesting is that Ian Bradley, when I was doing research for my book, I came across an update. Ian Bradley, the same author who wrote that very influential book in the 90s, wrote another book called Following the Celtic Way, a new assessment of Celtic Christianity. I thought that's interesting. When I read the book, I came to the conclusion that he and I were really on the same page, and which that was, for me, it was comforting that someone so influential as Ian Bradley had arrived at a similar viewpoint of what is Celtic Christianity, what is Celtic spirituality to me. And to answer the question, well, what is Celtic spirituality? Essentially, it is the Celtic spirituality is the Christian culture of the Celtic Church that existed from the 5th century to the medieval period. So it was an ancient way of following Jesus, if you put it like that. There was a Celtic church. It was distinct from other flavors of Christianity, if you will. It existed from the 5th century to the medieval period, then it was absorbed into the more dominant church of the time in the medieval era. But for a period of several centuries, there was a distinct church with dress codes and how they did prayer and liturgy and emphasis on differing aspects of the Christian walk. And that's not unusual. There are many differing views of Christianity in the world today. Obviously, we have Catholicism would be the largest. Well over 1 billion people are Catholics in the world and uh, following Jesus in that way. And we have Orthodoxy, and Orthodoxy is split into several different flavors as well. Then in 1517, Martin Luther pinned his theses to the door in Wittenberg, and that started what we now call the Protestant Reformation, and from that came a lot of other churches. There are hundreds of denominations today that essentially fall under that umbrella of Reformed Protestant churches, like Baptist churches, Presbyterian churches, Methodist churches, and all of them, uh, to some extent, agree on primary doctrine. Primary doctrine being that Jesus was born of a virgin, he was divine, he lived a sinless life, he suffered under Pontius Pilate, he was crucified, he died, he rose again on the third day, he ascended into heaven, and he will return. And there will be a final judgment. So that's primary doctrine. And to some extent, most of those churches, different flavors, agree with that. And I believe the Celtic Church also agreed with that. But then there are secondary issues and tertiary issues. There's how you dress, your style of worship, your style of liturgy, even having liturgy. Of course, many Protestant churches don't have liturgy. In the Baptist tradition, they just don't have that. How you approach Scripture, sola scriptura, or another way of interpreting how you feel God speaks to us today, things like that. So the Celtic Church did have differing ways of doing things. Celtic Christianity, they how they dressed, how they again their liturgies were quite unique, and they came out of a Celtic bardic culture that influenced their worship and their liturgies and their prayers. And I think I'll maybe do a second uh, blog on what that actually means. But so in many ways, what is Celtic spirituality? It was the particular flavor, if you will, of Christianity that existed in the first millennium in Ireland, in the islands of Ireland and Britain, predominantly. So it was existent in a period of time, and then it got absorbed, and it was no more. Then we had a revival of all things Celtic spiritual, dominantly in the 90s. But the question is, can you revive something that existed 1,000 years ago? Well, yes, you can, because some of that material from 1,000 years ago still exists. The prayers, the songs, um, they're still there. And many of the illustrated, illuminated manuscripts written at the time are still with us. Most of them were destroyed during the Viking era, but many of them are still with us, and so there's a lot of material to go on, and we can work with that material and be inspired by it. Um, so, in my view, what is Celtic spirituality? It is something that it did exist in the past. It existed in a period of time, and I believe God used it in a particular way, and that's what I essentially I write about in my book. And then it faded, and it uh, faded into history, if you will. And God did something else. And we see this throughout history. God raises up leaders and then deposes them and does something new and something different as history and culture moves. So, can we be inspired by that? And can we revive some of that and live by it and enjoy it? Yes, we can. But so that's what it was. It's Celtic Christianity is the faith culture of the islands of Ireland and Britain in the first millennium. That's it. Thank you. Bless you.